Hello and saludos from Guatemala through the magic of YouTube. This is Maria Martin, public radio, longtime public radio journalist, once based in Austin, where I created the program Latino USA for National Public Radio and the University of Texas. Now I'm based in Guatemala, where for the Gracias Vida Center for Media, I help train mostly rural and indigenous journalists. I so wish I could be there with you in person today to be part of this dialogue and valuable effort to archive the Central American revolutions, this time in history whose legacy has had such a lasting impact, not only on Central America and Central Americans, of course, but also for the United States. The growth of the Central American population has totally changed the fabric of the U.S. Latino community over the last 30 years. From the boom in restaurants that sell pupusas to the many franchises of pollo camperos all over the place, to the continuing migration north and the economic dependence all the countries of Central America have on remittances sent from California or Texas or Virginia, to the ongoing and large-scale deportations of Central Americans back to their home countries, nearly 50,000 Guatemalans in 2013 alone, some 38,000 from Honduras, and I think it's some 21,000 from El Salvador in 2013. These, of course, are unfolding stories still to be told in their entirety. Now, as we look back at the history of the roots of that displacement and at the various versions of history recorded at the time, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my Central America experience, which began a few years before I discovered my life's path in radio. In 1975, my travels to rediscover Mexico, the land of my birth, took me further south to a beautiful and exotic land, even poorer than Mexico, with hidden undertones of violence and other nastiness. When I went to Quetzaltenango to improve my Spanish, I heard of student leaders being killed. I saw the fear in the faces of the family that I lived with when I wanted to discuss politics. A few years later, I found myself at the country's first Latino owned public community radio station, KBBF, in Santa Rosa, California. First as a volunteer, then when the station went through a financial crisis and all the paid staff quit, and I left my job and my university studies to help keep the station on the air, as the station's very green news and public affairs director. It was 1978, just as the Sandinista revolution was escalating. On KBBF, it was on the news, Guatemala, Nicaragua, all the time. With news of the conflict, I relied on news services both in English and in Spanish, as well as reporting from the Nicaraguan community in the Bay Area. A little while later, I developed my very first radio news magazine called Mañana es Now, in which I reported on the 1978 massacre in Panzos, Alta Verapaz, Guatemala, the first of many large-scale military operations against the indigenous in this country that were to result in what a court here last year confirmed was a genocide. A few years later, in the early 80s, as the conflicts in Central America were spreading, and I was then the news and public affairs producer at KUOW in Seattle, the sister city to Managua, I interviewed a very young Rigoberta Menchú about what was happening in her country, about the impact of the model villages on the indigenous culture. I put the very eloquent bishop from Chiapas, Samuel Ruiz, on the air about the influx of indigenous Guatemalans into Mexico to flee the violence. Now, this was at a time when much of the U.S. media was ignoring Guatemala in favor of covering the conflicts in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Later still, I became the second editor and host of the English language segment of something called the Latin American News Service, a public radio project out of El Paso, Texas, that was started by Isabel Alegría, who'd come out of Pacifica Radio in KPFA in Berkeley. Now, I think this was a significant project in getting information out to the key decision-making audience of public and community radio. Um, Especially effective, I think, because we had native country reporters as well as foreign correspondents who were filing for us. And that provided us with a more rounded information base on which to take editorial decisions. Among our correspondents were people like Ellen Tomlinson and David Adams, David Golub, Lucy Hood, Susan Leffler, Martha Honey, as well as Julio Godoy in Guatemala, Oscar Ramirez and Alberto Barrera in El Salvador, Miguel Martí in Costa Rica, and so many others. Now, a great story about the Latin American News Service, the myth, perhaps, or the truth perhaps, is that it was Lance that trained then UPI print reporter John Burnett to become a radio reporter. And he then came under NPR's radar, and the rest is history. So, yeah, shout out to the Latin American News Service for that. Later, when I was at NPR in Washington, I reported on the peace processes and the 1990 Nicaraguan elections that saw the election of Violeta Chamorro from the point of view of a delegation of U.S. Latino elected officials who were there as electoral observers. When I left NPR to start up what became Latino USA, it was important to me to continue to cover Central America, even as the revolutions were winding down and the world had basically stopped watching. It was important to me because the U.S. Latino story is one that does not stop at the borders. It was also for this reason that I conceived of and produced the bilingual documentary project Después de las Guerras, Central America After the Wars, a 26-part series that tried to answer the questions: what happens when the fighting stops and the news teams pack up for the next high-stakes conflict? And have the intervening decades brought peace and democracy to Central America? And what is the legacy of the Central American revolutions for Central America and for the United States? Now, I'm telling you about my experience. It's just a small example, right, of the role that the alternative media played in this time, in telling this history, this story. The alternative media, including the so-called ethnic press and community and public radio, played, I think, a significant role in the construction of the debate during the Central American revolutions. These are outlets, for example, that tended to give greater coverage to the peace movement and the role that it played in that whole situation. Now, it's been said that the news media plays a critical role in the construction of the debate over U.S. foreign policy, and that journalists write the first draft of history. Now, if that's the case, then it behooves us to examine that first draft of the story of the Central American revolutions even more closely than it has been studied up to this point, and to be sure that it includes the role of the alternative press, especially when this was at a time when, as we found out during the Iran-Contra hearings, the U.S. State Department had an Office of Public Policy, or an Office of Public Diplomacy, I think it was called, whose purpose was to shape public opinion on Central American policy. They did this in part by planting op-eds in influential newspapers, by pressuring editors to get their reporters in line. I was reminded of this in the last few days in conversations I've had with people. Stories of State Department officials visiting National Public Radio after it ran a story on a Sandinista funeral of victims of a counterattack, of Elliot Abrams calling the network after then State Department correspondent Richard Gonzalez ran a story regarding military aid to El Salvador. So I wish I could be there to continue the conversation with you. If you're in Guatemala, please get in touch. And may this conference be just a beginning of a really valuable contribution to telling the story of the revolutions in Central America and in some ways to contributing to a brighter future for the region. Thank you so much.